Welcome to Intro to Motor Behavior. It is PEP360. And so we'll go ahead and get started with the first introductory lecture here for you. When we talk about human motion, we talk about two different components. We usually think of things being genetically coded, and then we also think about movements that we generally learn through our lifetime. And the way we analyze and the way we think about these components is different between individuals, right? So I want you to think as you go through this class and as you anticipate and look through motion, how do you classify skill? What is your idea of skill? And do you think of people as being naturally skilled, or do you think of this process of learning? And do you think that there's a genetic cap, or do you think that you have the ability to learn everything? Right, so I want you to think about this quote as we go through, and skill consists in the ability to bring about some end result with maximum certainty and minimum outlay of energy, time, and energy, right? And so this is the idea that as we become more skilled, we think less about it. Our movements are more precise and we don't have to do a lot of wasted energy. And so as we go through the process, some things that took a long time, like I just rode my bike to school this morning with my son, and for him, learning to ride a bike without training wheels took a lot, but now it's natural and he can go up and down hills and all the way to school. So motor behavior is defined as the study of human movement. And when we think about human movement, we specifically think about motor skills through combined perspectives. And these three are learned, controlled, and developed. And so if we define them individually, motor control is simply the study of how the central nervous system, so brain and spinal cord, create this information processing component. And they are really structure the patterns of motion. And you'll hear us talk about a motor pattern or a movement pattern quite a bit in this class. Motor learning is simply the study of how practice and experience affect how these movements are learned, right? So there's ways that we can structure practice. There's ways that individuals, whether you're novice or experienced or advanced, elderly versus young, and how that also affects how you learn the movement. If we look into the foundations of motor behavior and motor learning, we really look at and identify two areas of research that emerged back in the 70s, and that is neurophysiology. That branch concerned with how the neurons, the central nervous system connects with the peripheral and creates movement through motor neurons and motor units. And then we also think about psychology, and that's really thinking about the higher levels of skill. Really nothing to do with the neurological mechanisms, but how we're thinking and the processes inside of the psychology and what we're thinking about, right? So again, these all kind of merged back in the 70s because they had some kind of commonalities in their focus and really what's happening with the electrons and the units inside of the central nervous system and how those connect out to the peripheral and how everything is organized and connected, right? Everything in our body is not individually oriented. There's some pattern connection between them all. And so now when we look at skill classification, we want to think about two basic classifications. And that one is based on the movement actually being made. And then one is the perceptual attributions of that task, or how you perceive the task to be, or different components, and whether you think it's hard, easy. And so those are the kind of ideas that we have. And then you have the movements made. And the way we classify the movements being made is by either being discrete, or there's a start and finish, continuous, which is a continuous cycle like running or walking, or a serial, where you combine a series of discrete tasks into a continuous flow. Think about something like a dance routine or a gymnastics routine. And then the perceptual attributes are defined as an opened or closed dimension, right? Is it something that's predictable versus unpredictable? So let's go through and define each of these a little bit more for you. And so the discrete movements, again, there's a defined beginning and end, right? So when I go up for a high jump, I know when I'm starting, and then it ends when I hit the mat and roll off, and the bar is either up or not. In the golf swing, I approach the ball, I swing the club back, and then I swing and do my follow through, right? So there's a very defined, temporally oriented beginning and end of it, right? And so we know when we've started the task and when the task is completed. Conversely, we have continuous movements. And these are the kind of concept where there's no beginning and no end of the movement. It's just that continuous, and you can have these arbitrary components. And we do this with running and walking, where we do one cycle, right? So we can define a heel strike to a heel strike, and that's one cycle. So, but the idea of walking and running is it's really just continuous. And we've had to create these arbitrary moments where it's stopping. Now, One of the things we're going to look at a lot in this class is going to be different research studies over the years and really over the last 5 or 6 decades that have helped kind of create these concepts and these theories. In the first one, we talk about continuous task, and we do these things called tracking tasks. And you'll see a few of these, and throughout, when you look at everything, you'll see these kind of blue links. And if you click on those, it takes you to a YouTube channel. So if you go back to the PowerPoint, you can see that, right? But a tracking task is this very common method, and really what it is it's either computer-based or there's some other kind of mechanism on the ground where you're trying to track or follow the path of something, right? And typically you have to keep some device with a limb, or sometimes there's other components too, but that's the idea, right? And then there's two components to it. You could either do a pursuit tracking where the visual perception or the visual feedback for you see the experimenter and the subject, right? So think about something where you're trying to track a flying object on a computer screen. You see the flying object, and then you also see the cursor, the mouse, and you see both of those displayed, right? And then that's a pursuit tracking. Then you have this thing called the compensatory tracking, and that is you don't see both mouse and whatever you're trying to track. You actually just see the difference between the two movements. So typically there's some value or some distance, right? So maybe it's a line, and you need to make the line shorter because it's the 2 points between your cursor and the object you're trying to track. And so those are the type of things. So remember, when we talk about tracking tasks, we're referring to something that's continuous movements. And then there's two components of it. There's pursuit tracking, where you see both the person doing the tracking and the object being tracked, or there's compensatory tracking, which is the difference between the two. And this is what I was talking about. So if you go back to the PowerPoint and you see those three things up there in the blue: tracking task, pursuit tracking, and two, this will give you an idea of what these things look like. And if you think about it, so this is a plane coming to landing, and that's an idea of a compensatory tracking, right? And so what they do is they just see the difference between the horizon and where the plane is going, and that's something it gives a feedback to the pilot so they know where they're going, right? Now, when we do these tracking tasks, there's different ways that you can increase or decrease the level of difficulty, and that goes back to a biomechanics concept of position, velocity, acceleration, right? So position is the first domain, and so it's the easiest tracking task to do. You just do position between whatever you're trying to track and yourself. If you're trying to match the velocity, that means the movement of your motion has to be the same speed of which whatever you're trying to track, not necessarily from position A to B, but you have to go from A to B in the same velocity. And then of course acceleration, just a little bit more difficult. So then we have these things called serial movements, right? So we've gone through discrete, gone through continuous, and now we're at serial, and these are just a series of individual movements that are created together, right? And so I've put half pipe and gymnastics down there, and those are actually videos, so if you want. But this is like basically when you're creating a routine or creating something, there's individual tasks that are going to have very discrete, and then you kind of sync them together in this temporal arrangement of how you want to perform them. And so this is really how serial movements are created. And this is just a little bit of a diagram to help you kind of understand a little bit more. You have discrete on the far left, continuous on the far right, so that's a continuum. And then you have serial in the movement in the middle, and then so you have defined as, right? So there's a recognizable beginning and end versus no recognizable beginning and end. There's this arbitrary kind of component to it. And then you have that in the middle, which is these discrete actions that are strung together. And then on the bottom, just some more examples for you to kind of review. And then we have these kind of other components too, and these are this perceptual of the environment, and you have the open skill versus the closed skill tasks. And again, if you see this on the very top, it's based on the environmental predictability of the task, right? So think about a batter up to bat in the baseball, and the pitcher throwing the baseball versus a kid hitting off a T-ball, right? So if I'm hitting a T-ball, the ball doesn't move. It's a very predictable, very close skill swing. If I'm in the major leagues and I have a pitcher up there, they have a multitude of pitches they can throw, right? And so if I have a knuckleballer versus I have somebody who's got a great fastball versus a curveball versus a slider, these are all different pitches, and they all come at you and are behaving differently. And that's an open skill, right? So I'm going to have my swing, but my swing has to be able to be adjusted based off the perception, right? So closed skill, the environment is stable. It's not changing. It's very predictable. Versus the open skill, which the environment is very consistently changing. It varies. We don't know. It's unpredictable, right? So you cannot have a pre-planned beginning and stop or an execution. You have to be able to be adjustable through your swing or through any other task. Think about a tennis player. Think about, right? So I have these two images here where I have a bowler, right? And if I'm on the bowling alley, it's a very, and I have these switched around for you. I should probably switch them, but it makes it easy. So just know that as you're looking at these images, that the bowler is not the closed. The bowler actually over here goes along with the skilled or the closed, and the hockey player is the open, right? So just make sure that you know how those go together, because a goalie has to respond to whatever the person shooting the puck does, where a bowler just knows that those pins are down there and he has to roll it down the lane. It's very close. It's a matter of his being able to complete his pre-planned motion. So again, here's just another table or graph depicting closed and open on the two ends. So it's a very predictable versus a non-predictable or unpredictable environment.